They said don't make eye contact. They said don't speak unless spoken to. They said if he walks into the room, move. Before we start this story, I need you to understand something about this man. Kang Jae-won didn't just dislike women. He removed every single female employee from his private estate. He once walked out of a billion-dollar meeting because the opposing team sent a woman to lead negotiations. His own mother hadn't spoken to him in 6 years. This man was not a project. He was not a damaged soul waiting to be healed. He was a wall, solid, cold, built from something that happened so long ago it had become who he was. And nobody in Seoul was brave enough or foolish enough to test it. Until a woman walked through his private entry lane on a Monday morning with a coffee she had no business carrying, got her hair tangled in his shirt, looked up at the most dangerous man in the country, and told him to hold still. She had no idea who he was, and somehow that was exactly the problem. But before we dive in fully, I want to know where you're all watching from. Drop your country in the comments right now. And if you want to know how this story ends, hit subscribe and don't you dare move. Because this is going to be intense. The table cracked. Not broke. Cracked. Right down the center of the conference room's imported marble surface, splitting the reflection of 12 terrified board members clean in half. The man standing at the head of it hadn't even raised his voice. He'd simply pressed both palms flat against the surface and leaned forward. And the pressure alone, the sheer concentrated weight of his stillness, had done what most men's rage couldn't. Kang Jae-won straightened his cuffs. I said, he repeated, his Korean low and deliberate, each word landing like a separate verdict, that the figures you presented to my father 3 months before his death were fabricated. And what I want to know, what I have been very patient in waiting to hear, is which one of you approved them. Silence. 12 men in expensive suits and not a single spine between them. Jae-won had been back in Seoul for exactly 6 days. In that time, he had dissolved 2 subsidiary boards, replaced the entire security detail at Kang Corporation's headquarters, and personally reviewed 11 years of financial records that his father's advisors had assured everyone were clean. They were not clean. They were so dirty they had their own ecosystem. He picked up his phone from the table, slid it into his breast pocket, and looked at each man in the room with the kind of calm that precedes total destruction. You have until Friday, he said. Names, amounts, documentation. Or I start making decisions without your input. He walked out. His assistant, Park Sung-min, fell into step behind him immediately, tablet clutched to his chest, footsteps quick and careful, the way a man walks when he knows the ground beneath him shifts without warning. The new staff orientation is this morning, sir. Human Resources is asking if you'll do the welcome address as your father. No. They've also flagged that your private entry lane had an unauthorized swipe this morning. A new secretary in the administrative pool, apparently. Jae-won stopped walking. Slowly, he turned. She used my lane. Sung-min checked his tablet. Rachel Mensah, Day 1. She claims she didn't know. A muscle in Jae-won's jaw moved. Make sure she knows. He started walking again. Behind him, Sung-min exhaled very quietly and typed a note he had absolutely no intention of delivering in those exact words. Rachel Mensah had not, in fact, known. In her defense, there were no signs, no labels, no distinguished markings that separated the left entry lane from the right one, except that the left lane had a shorter line, and Rachel had a coffee in one hand, and her orientation folder in the other, and she was already 4 minutes behind schedule. She swiped through. The gate accepted her badge. Simple. What wasn't simple was what happened next. The crowd behind her shifted in a way that felt almost choreographed. Bodies stepping back, chins dropping, a collective intake of breath that Rachel registered the same way you register a change in weather. Something atmospheric, something that raised the hair on the back of your neck before your brain caught up with your instincts. She had just cleared the gate when she felt it, a sharp pull at the back of her head. Not painful, exactly. More like the universe grabbing her by the hair to say pay attention. Her hair was caught. Specifically, it was caught in the button of a suit jacket. A very expensive suit jacket, given the quality of the fabric, now pressing against the back of her neck. She stopped moving. Whoever was behind her stopped moving. Around them, a circle of silence spread like something had been dropped in still water. Rachel did not panic. She assessed. She turned her head carefully, as far as she could without pulling, and processed what she saw in sections. Charcoal suit, broad chest, the collar of a white shirt with a button that had somehow threaded itself through the twist of her natural hair, like it had been specifically engineered to do so. Tattoos beginning at the wrist, disappearing under the cuff. She cataloged all of this before she looked up. The man looking down at her had a face that was almost unreasonably structured, the kind of bone architecture that photographers spent careers chasing. Dark eyes, a jaw that seemed permanently set at a decision. He looked at her the way you look at a problem you didn't create, but are now expected to solve. Rachel looked back at him the way she looked at spreadsheet errors, directly, without drama. "Hold still," she said. "I'll get it." She heard someone behind her make a sound that might have been a swallowed scream. The man said nothing. His jaw shifted slightly. Rachel handed her coffee to the nearest person, a woman who accepted it with both hands and the expression of someone receiving a live grenade, and reached back to begin working the button free from her hair. It was thoroughly knotted, the kind of tangle that had opinions about being resolved. "Scissors," someone said from the crowd. "We should get scissors." "Touch my hair with scissors," Rachel said pleasantly, "and I will find you specifically." The man behind her, and she still had not asked his name, which in retrospect was information several people in the lobby clearly wanted her to have, made a sound low in his throat. Not quite a word. More like the sound of a decision being made. "Get scissors," he said. Rachel stopped working at the knot and straightened as much as she could. "I said no." "I didn't ask you." "You didn't need to. It's my hair. My answer is no. Hold still and let me work it out." The silence around them had achieved a kind of religious quality. People had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. This was, Rachel would later understand, because no one in the 3-year history of Kang Jae-won's reputation had ever told him no twice in under 30 seconds, in the same sentence, while tangled to his shirt. It took 4 minutes. 4 full minutes of careful, methodical untangling, while the most dangerous man in Seoul stood absolutely still. Not because she'd asked him to, he would tell himself later, but because movement would have made it worse. That was the only reason. That was entirely the reason. When the last strand finally released, Rachel smoothed her hair back, retrieved her coffee from the traumatized woman who had been holding it, and continued toward the elevator bank without a backward glance. Jae-won stood in the center of his own lobby and watched her walk away. Sung-min appeared at his elbow. "Should I still send the memo about the entry lane, sir?" Jae-won said nothing for a moment. Then, "Who hired her?" "HR, sir. Former senior forensic accountant. Took the secretary position after her firm collapsed." Another pause. "Forensic accountant." "Yes, sir." He walked toward the executive elevator. "Send the memo." And this, because the universe has a specific sense of humor, is exactly when Rachel found the executive elevator. She had been perfectly content with the main elevator bank until she saw the crowd. 14 people waiting, 2 cars running slow, and Rachel had an orientation packet due at the 9th floor in 3 minutes. She spotted the separate elevator bay around the corner. 1 car, Doors almost closed. She walked faster. She made it. Barely. Her shoulder cleared the doors as they slid shut, and she exhaled, pressing the button for 9, and turned to find herself sharing roughly 8 square feet of black-walled, mahogany-paneled, aggressively expensive elevator space with the man from the lobby, and his assistant, and 2 security personnel. The doors sealed. Rachel looked at the interior, looked at the man, looked back at the interior. Ah, said some part of her brain. Too late, said another part. Jae-won looked at her staff lanyard, looked at her floor selection, looked at her face with the expression of a man assembling evidence. You realize, he said, that this elevator is not for your position. I realize that now, Rachel said. The doors were closing. So you forced your way in? I walked quickly. There's a difference. He studied her with those dark, unreadable eyes. It wasn't enough. The entry lane this morning, my shirt, my button. Now you're in my elevator. How exactly did you pass the interview process? Rachel turned to face him fully. The elevator was not large. This put approximately 18 inches between them, which Rachel treated as a perfectly reasonable professional distance, and Jae-won's security personnel treated as a structural emergency. Your shirt, she said. So you're the one from the lobby. She looked at him with fresh assessment. The tattoos, the posture, the way everyone in the elevator had subtly leaned away from him. Let me be direct with you. The way you spoke to me this morning, and the way you're speaking to me right now, tells me a great deal about how you were raised. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and assume someone simply forgot to teach you that volume and aggression are not the same as authority. Sungmin made a sound like a man whose soul was briefly leaving his body. Jae-won tilted his head, a very small movement. Fire her, he said to Sungmin, conversational, like ordering coffee. You can't fire me, Rachel said. You're not my boss. She pressed her orientation folder to her chest. And I'll tell you something else. I've heard a great deal about the new CEO of this company in the last 48 hours. That he's sharp, that he's serious, that he came back from abroad with exactly 0 patience for incompetence. She looked Jae-won up and down with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely not impressed. You, with your elevator politics and your entry lane ego, cannot be that man. That man has too much actual power to waste it on this. So whoever you are, please stay in your lane, literally and otherwise. The elevator opened on the 9th floor. Rachel walked out. The doors closed. Sungmin stared at the floor number display for a long moment. Then, carefully, he said, Should I still? What floor did she say she was going to? Jae-won asked. 9, sir. HR orientation. Jae-won looked at the closed doors. Something moved behind his eyes that Sungmin had worked for him for 4 years and had never seen before. He couldn't name it. He filed it away. Find out everything she was hired to do, Jae-won said, and send the firing paperwork to HR. That evening, Rachel sat on her apartment floor with her shoes off and her phone pressed to her ear, eating leftover jollof rice and feeling fairly good about her first day, all things considered. He was so rude, Dara. Tattoos everywhere, standing there like the air owed him rent. Her best friend's voice came back tight with something Rachel identified as restrained panic. Rach, you said tattoos. You said came back from abroad. You said everyone went quiet when he walked in because he has a personality disorder. Clearly, Rachel, a breath. No one has seen the new CEO yet, not in person. The chairman died a month ago, and his son flew back, and he's been operating from inside the building, but there's been no formal introduction yet. What if the man in the elevator is him? Rachel laughed. It was a genuinely warm laugh. Dara, listen to me. A CEO, The head of a corporation worth billions does not spend his morning throwing tantrums about elevator access. He does not stand in lobbies complaining about staff using the wrong gate. He has people for that. The man I met today is some mid-level manager who confused a designer suit for a personality. She scooped up another forkful of rice. I'm reporting him to the actual CEO tomorrow, after the all-staff assembly. First thing. Silence on the line. Dara? I'm praying for you, Dara said. Genuinely. I'm going to light a candle. Good night. Rachel hung up, smiled at her ceiling, and went to bed completely certain she had correctly assessed the situation. She had not. If you're already obsessed with Rachel and this man, she has no idea she's been disrespecting for an entire day. Drop a comment right now and let me know. And if you're new here, subscribe. Because this story is only getting started. The all-staff assembly started at 8. Rachel arrived at 8:03, slipped into the back of the auditorium, and told herself 3 minutes was practically on time. The room was packed. Every floor, every department, every level of Kang Corporation squeezed into tiered seating that curved around a raised platform at the front. There was a podium. There was a microphone. There was a junior analyst named Cho standing at that microphone, looking like a man who had made several poor decisions that had culminated in this specific moment. Cho was being asked to explain a discrepancy in the third quarter distribution report. His supervisor had thrown him to the platform the way you throw something overboard to slow a pursuing ship. Cho knew this. Everyone knew this. Cho had been speaking for approximately 90 seconds and had said nothing that qualified as an explanation. Rachel watched him for about 30 more seconds. Her brain, which had spent 6 years eating financial discrepancies for breakfast, had already located the problem, traced it back to its source, and drafted 3 ways to explain it clearly. She was in the back of the room. She was 3 minutes late. She was, by every professional and social metric available, not the person who should speak right now. She raised her voice anyway. It's a timing mismatch, she said, clearly enough to carry. The distribution figures were recorded on invoice date, not delivery date. 2 of the largest transfers fell in the last 3 days of Q3, but weren't physically completed until Q4 opened. It inflated one quarter and understated the next. It's not a loss, it's a ledger placement error, easily corrected with a 1-line adjustment and a note to standardize recording protocol going forward. Silence. Then someone started clapping. Then 3 more people. Then a ripple of genuine, relieved applause spread through the room because Cho looked like he might actually cry with gratitude, and the explanation had been so clean and so fast that the tension in the room dissolved almost instantly. Rachel smoothed her folder and exhaled quietly. Good. Done. Moving on. Then a hand came down on the table at the front of the room. Not a slam. Something more controlled than a slam, which somehow made it worse. A single, deliberate impact that didn't need volume because the entire room felt it in their chests like a frequency. The man at the head table rose slowly. Rachel's view from the back had been obstructed by seating and distance, and she had registered the figure at the front only as a silhouette. But as the room went from relieved applause to absolute graveyard stillness in under 2 seconds, she straightened, looked harder. The silhouette turned, and Rachel, for the first time in the 26 hours she had been employed at Kang Corporation, felt the specific cold clarity of a woman who has just realized she has been wrong about something important. It was him. The elevator, the lobby, the button, and the hair, and the fire heard delivered like a footnote. Him, at the head table, in the seat that was slightly larger than all the others, in front of the placard that she could now that she was looking, now that she was actually looking, read clearly from across the room. Kang Jae-won, Chief Executive Officer. Did anyone, he said, his voice completely level, dangerously level, the vocal equivalent of a flat line on a monitor. "Ask you to speak?" Rachel's heart did something complicated. Her face did not. "The answer was needed," she said. "I had it. You walked into this assembly late, and you had the audacity to speak without being addressed." His eyes found her across the room with a precision that suggested he'd known exactly where she was sitting since she walked in. "Apologize for the interruption." The room was not breathing. Rachel stood up straighter. "I'm not going to apologize for solving a problem. If the expectation in this company is that people stay quiet while a colleague drowns in front of an audience, that's a culture issue, not mine." Someone beside her whispered, urgent and terrified. "That's the CEO, the new CEO. I know," Rachel said quietly. And then, because she was Rachel Mensah and she had clocked the placard and processed the information and arrived at her conclusion, she looked directly at Kang Jae-won across the full length of the auditorium and said, at a volume the room could hear, "I owe you an apology for interrupting the assembly. I don't owe you one for the answer I gave." She picked up her folder. "I'll see HR about the firing paperwork on my way out." She walked out of the auditorium. The doors closed behind her. Nobody in the room spoke for a full 4 seconds. Then Cho, who had more reasons than anyone to be grateful, looked down at his hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. At the head table, Kang Jae-won sat back down. His expression had not changed. But Sung-min, sitting 2 seats away, watched his employer's eyes track the door for just a moment longer than necessary, and thought privately that the firing paperwork might not go through after all. Rachel did not go to HR. She went to the wrong floor first, pressed 7 instead of 6 in the secondary elevator, stepped out into a corridor that was quieter and wider than it should have been for an administrative level, and followed it around a corner before she realized the room at the end of the hall had its door slightly open, and the voices inside were sharp and fast and not meant to be overheard. She was turning to leave when she heard numbers. Specifically, she heard a figure, 9 zeros long, described as already moved and untraceable by Friday. She heard a name she recognized from the acquisition files she'd been handed at orientation as a completed, clean deal. She heard the words before the new CEO finds the secondary ledger. Rachel stood very still in the corridor. Then she walked backward, around the corner, and stood with her back against the wall, with the focused, electric calm of a woman whose forensic accountant brain had just caught fire. She pulled out her orientation folder. She wrote 3 things on the inside cover from memory. Then she went to the correct floor, sat at her assigned desk, and spent the rest of the morning performing the exact job description of a secretary with such disciplined normalcy that no one would have guessed she was mentally reconstructing a financial architecture she had no business being able to see yet. At 12:47, someone placed a coffee on her desk. She looked up. It was not someone she recognized. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of carefully blank expression that meant he was delivering a message he had not written. "From the CEO's office," he said. "He asks that you come up at 2. Rachel looked at the coffee. It was exactly the order she'd been holding when she walked through the entry lane that morning. Black, 1 sugar, the specific medium roast that only 2 coffee shops in this district stocked. He'd noticed, or he'd asked someone who noticed. Either way, she picked up the cup slowly, and the warmth of it spread through her palms in a way she found inconveniently difficult to dismiss. "Tell him I'll be there," she said. The executive floor was a different country. Rachel stepped out of the elevator at 1:58 and stood for a moment in a corridor that smelled like leather and cedar and the particular expensive silence of rooms where large decisions get made. Floor-to-ceiling glass on one side overlooking Seoul's skyline, understated artwork. No clutter. Sung-min met her at the entrance to the main office and looked at her, The way a man looks at someone walking calmly towards something he can see, and she cannot. "Miss Mensah," he said carefully. "Sungmin," she said, because she'd learned his name from the orientation chart that morning, and Rachel Mensah learned the name of every person in a room before she needed them. He blinked, let her in. The office was wide and dark-toned, and Jae-won was standing at the window, with his back to the door, when she entered, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, looking out at the city the way men look at things they own. The tattoos that had seemed aggressive in a lobby, and an elevator looked different here. Detailed, deliberate, each one a decision. Rachel stood in the center of the room and did not sit down until she was ready to. He turned. The space between them, the desk, 12 feet of premium flooring, and whatever this was, felt charged in a way that had nothing to do with the firing paperwork he was presumably about to produce. "Sit," he said. "In a moment," she said. His jaw shifted. She sat down. "You lasted 1 day," he said, moving to his desk, "before making yourself impossible to ignore. I wasn't trying to be noticed. I was doing the job correctly." "You were doing a job, not yours. The job needed doing. I was qualified." She crossed her legs and kept her eyes on him steadily. "You brought me up here to fire me in person. Most executives send an email." "I brought you up here," he said, settling into his chair and looking at her across the desk with an attention that was entirely too focused to be purely professional. "Because I looked at your file this morning." Rachel said nothing. "Forensic accountant, 6 years. Firm collapsed 3 months ago under a corruption investigation. You testified to the regulator, named 3 senior partners, and walked away with your professional license completely intact." He paused. "Why did you take a secretary position?" "Because I needed income while I looked for the right opportunity." "And is this the right opportunity?" She met his gaze without blinking. "It might be becoming one." Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, nothing so obvious. More like a barometric change, the kind you feel before weather. Jae-won leaned back in his chair and studied her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. It was not the cold assessment from the lobby. It was not the controlled fury from the auditorium. It was something more unsettling than either. Something that looked like a man recalibrating. "You corrected my acquisition whiteboard this morning," he said. "In the middle of a board session you had no access to." Rachel's chin lifted slightly. "The door was open. The number was wrong. A $14 million wrong. You walked in off a wrong turn and caught a $14 million error in under 30 seconds. I caught it in under 10, she said. I took the other 20 to make sure." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Jae-won's eyes moved over her face, not the way men usually looked at her, cataloging and assessing her attractiveness like she was inventory. This was different. This was the way you look at something that has surprised you, and you are not yet sure whether to be pleased or alarmed. Rachel felt it land on her skin like a change in temperature. She kept her expression neutral through what she recognized, with some private irritation, as genuine effort. "The firing paperwork has been withdrawn," he said. "I know," she said. "You wouldn't have sent the coffee if you were still planning to fire me." His eyes narrowed, not in anger, in something that looked uncomfortably close to amusement. "You're going to be difficult," he said. "You're going to be challenged," she replied. "Those are different things." She stood, smoothed her skirt, and picked up her folder. "Is there anything else, or should I get back to the work I'm presumably still employed to do?" He said nothing for a moment, just watched her. And in the quality of that silence, in the way his eyes tracked her toward the door, with an attention he wasn't bothering to disguise, Rachel felt something she hadn't expected and absolutely did not have time for. She felt seen, not assessed, not evaluated. Seen, the way you feel when someone looks at you and locates something accurate. She kept walking. Miss Mensah. She stopped, did not turn immediately. One breath. Then she looked back over her shoulder. "The coffee order," he said. "You didn't ask how I knew it." "I didn't need to," she said. "You're thorough. I'm going to need to remember that." She walked out. Behind her, in an office overlooking all of Seoul, Kang Jae-won sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Sung-min. "Move her desk," he said. "She's auditing the clean books. Full access." A pause. "Sir." "She was hired as a secretary." "She was hired wrong," Jae-won said. "Fix it." He hung up, looked back at the window. Outside, Seoul spread in every direction like a circuit board, bright and complicated, and full of things running beneath the surface that most people never saw. He thought about the way she'd said, "You're going to be challenged," without a single tremor in her voice. He thought about it longer than he should have. Comment below. Are you Team Rachel, or are you already falling for this man? Because something tells me this story is about to get very complicated. Like this video, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you don't want to. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of Rachel arriving before everyone and leaving after most. Of spreadsheets that told stories their authors never intended. Of a desk that had been quietly moved to the executive floor without formal announcement or explanation, which caused exactly the level of speculation Rachel had expected and responded to with exactly the level of engagement she had available for other people's opinions, which was none. 3 weeks of Kang Jae-won finding reasons to walk past her desk that were slightly too frequent to be coincidental and slightly too purposeful to be accidental, and neither of them acknowledging this, because acknowledging it would require one of them to say something neither was ready to say. The tension between them had become its own presence in the office. Staff felt it when they were both in the same room. Conversations shortened. People stopped lingering. It was the specific electricity of two people who were very carefully not looking at each other while being completely unable to stop. On a Thursday evening, Rachel stayed late, untangling a secondary ledger that was bothering her. The same one she'd overheard referenced in the corridor on her first day. She hadn't forgotten. She never forgot numbers. She had simply been building context first, the way you don't pull a thread until you understand what it's holding together. She was deep in a spreadsheet when she heard his footsteps. She knew his walk by now. She would not have admitted this under interrogation. He stopped at her desk, looked at her screen, said nothing for a moment. "You should have gone home 2 hours ago," he said. "So should you," she said, without looking up. He pulled the chair from the adjacent empty desk and sat down beside her, not across beside, and looked at her screen with the focused attention he gave everything that mattered to him. This close, she could smell his cologne, something dark and unhurried that had absolutely no business being as distracting as it was. "The secondary ledger," he said quietly. "You already know about it. I found it 4 days ago. I found it on my first day." She finally looked at him. This close, in the low evening light of the office, the angles of his face were softer than they had any right to be. "I've been tracing it backward. Whoever built this structure knew exactly how your father reviewed accounts. They built the concealment around his blind spots." Something moved behind his eyes, something old and sharp. "Someone who knew him," Jae-won said. "Someone close," Rachel said. "I have 3 names. I need 2 more days to be certain." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Rachel's pulse did something inconvenient that she addressed by looking back at the spreadsheet. "Why didn't you bring this to me earlier?" he asked. His voice had dropped without him seeming to notice. "Because half-built evidence protects the guilty," she said. "I needed it complete." He was quiet. Then, You've been protecting this investigation. Alone, on a secretary's salary. I've been doing my job, she said. The one I was actually hired for, even if the paperwork said otherwise. He reached across her desk and closed her laptop gently. The movement brought his arm close enough to brush hers, and neither of them moved away, and the air between them contracted to something small and warm and very still. Come, he said. I'll drive you home. That's not necessary. It's late, and you know things that someone in this building would prefer you didn't. His eyes held hers. I'm not asking as your employer. Rachel looked at him for a beat. Then what are you asking as? He didn't answer. But the way he looked at her was its own answer, quiet and certain, and Rachel picked up her bag. They didn't go straight home. He stopped at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office. Small, warm lit, the kind of place that existed in the gaps between Seoul's louder, brighter options. Rachel recognized it immediately. It was hers, the one she passed every evening, the one she'd been coming to for 2 years. How did you know about this place? She asked. You mentioned it your 3rd day, he said, when you were on the phone. You didn't know I was in the corridor. She stared at him. You listened to my phone call? I walked past during it. A pause, something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. You have strong opinions about coffee. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no boardroom, no hierarchy, no battlefield. Just 2 people and 2 cups, and the particular honesty that comes with tiredness and low light. He told her about his father. Not everything, not the parts that still had edges sharp enough to cut, but enough. That the man had built something enormous and protected it fiercely and died before Jae-won could tell him that he understood why, finally, after years of resisting the inheritance. Rachel told him about the firm, about walking into the regulator's office, knowing that naming her senior partners would end her career as she'd built it, and doing it anyway, because the numbers didn't lie, and she couldn't. You burned your own life down to tell the truth, Jae-won said. I built it back, she said. Slower, but cleaner. He looked at her across the table with that recalibrating expression she'd seen in his office 3 weeks ago. Except now it was closer. Now it had somewhere to land. Rachel, he said. Just her name. The way you say something you've been holding carefully. Her phone rang. She glanced at it. Her boyfriend Daniel's name on the screen. First call in 11 days. She remembered suddenly, with a lurch, that today was her birthday. She had not remembered until this moment. That said something she didn't want to examine. She let it ring. Jae-won noticed. Said nothing. They walked out 20 minutes later into the cool night air, and Rachel saw them before her brain fully processed what she was seeing. Daniel. Outside, 20 feet away, at the standing tables of the bar next door. With a woman. His hand at the woman's waist, his mouth at her ear, laughing at something in the specific, easy way of a man, completely comfortable in what he was doing. Rachel stopped walking. Jae-won stopped beside her. She crossed the distance without deciding to. Daniel. He turned. Saw her. The woman beside him did not move away, and Daniel did not drop his hand. And in that single moment, Rachel understood the full geometry of the last 11 days. Rachel. He said her name the way you say the name of an inconvenience. It's my birthday, she said. Quietly. Not as an accusation, almost as information. Like she was still making sure she had the facts right. I know. He exhaled. Look, you should hear this from me. We're done. You lost your real position. You're someone's secretary now, and I need someone who... He gestured vaguely, cruelly. Matches where I'm going. Rachel said nothing. The woman beside him had the grace to look away. Your parents know about the engagement, Rachel said. My parents wanted your salary. He stepped closer and lowered his voice and said the rest of it. The parts that were designed specifically to reduce her, to make her feel the distance between who she'd been and who she was now as a wound. He finished it with a small laugh. He put his hand on her shoulder to move her aside. Then his hand was gone. Jae-won had removed it, not violently, with the particular controlled precision of a man who has decided something and is implementing it calmly. He stepped forward so that he was slightly in front of Rachel without blocking her, his presence reshaping the entire dynamic of the pavement. He looked at Daniel the way he'd looked at the board table 3 weeks ago. I know your company, he said quietly. I know your managing director. I know your 3 largest contracts. He reached into his jacket and offered his card between 2 fingers with an almost courteous gesture. Call me Friday if you'd like to discuss the terms under which those contracts renew. Daniel looked at the card, looked up, recognition and cold dread arriving together. Jae-won put the card away, turned to Rachel. Ready? She looked at him. This man she'd accused of being a spoiled brat. This man whose hair button she'd spent 4 minutes untangling in a crowded lobby. This man who had closed her laptop gently and remembered her coffee shop and sat across from her tonight like she was something worth sitting across from. In his car, wrapped in the warmth and the silence, Rachel felt the dam inside her chest fracture along a line she hadn't known was under pressure. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't reach for her. He simply drove and let her have the feeling without making it smaller. After a long moment, she said, Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. He was never worth your silence. She looked at him in the dark of the car. He was watching the road. His jaw was set, but not hard. Something different. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, a great deal like protectiveness. Jae-won, she said. He glanced at her. First name. First time. Happy birthday, he said quietly. And Rachel, who had not cried once through a collapsed firm, a demolished career, and a public humiliation, felt her eyes fill without permission and looked out the window so he wouldn't see. He saw. He said nothing. He drove. And somewhere in the quiet between them, something that had been building for 3 weeks settled into place like the last number in a column that finally balances. If this story wrecked you in the best way, comment, like, and subscribe. Rachel and Jae-won are just getting started. You do not want to miss what comes next. He drove for 6 minutes before Rachel spoke. Not small talk. Not the careful, managed version of herself she presented to boardrooms and difficult men. The real voice. The one that only came out when something had been broken open. Sleep with me. The car didn't swerve. Jae-won's hands didn't tighten on the wheel. But something in the quality of his stillness changed. The way a room changes when someone says the thing everyone was thinking, and the air has to reorganize itself around the honesty of it. Rachel, I mean it. Her voice was steady, steadier than she felt. The man I kept myself for years, Jae-won years, just humiliated me on my birthday outside a bar. I made a decision about my body a long time ago, and I made it for him, and he just told me to my face that I'm not worth his time anymore. She turned to look at him. I still want tonight to mean something. I'd rather it mean something with someone who has actually looked at me like I'm a person than wasted on a memory of someone who never deserved it. The city moved past the windows. Seoul at night, all light and motion, and the particular loneliness of being small inside something enormous. Jae-won pulled the car over. Not dramatically. He simply found a quiet stretch of road, eased to the curb, and cut the engine. Then he turned to face her in the dark, with an expression that Rachel had never seen on him before, and could not immediately name. It was not the CEO. It was not the man from the lobby, or the elevator, or the auditorium. It was something underneath all of those. Something unguarded and direct, and almost unbearably careful. "You are not a decision made out of pain," he said quietly. Rachel opened her mouth. "Let me finish." His voice was low. "I have wanted to be in a room alone with you since the 4th minute of the first day you walked into my building and told me not to cut your hair. That is not a secret I'm particularly proud of keeping." His eyes moved over her face with the same attention he gave financial reports and hostile takeovers. Complete, unhurried, missing nothing. "But I will not be the man you chose because another man failed you tonight. That's not what I want from you." The silence between them was so full, it had weight. "What do you want?" Rachel asked. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Everything," he said simply. "Which means I can wait." Rachel stared at him. This man, this ruthless, cold, table-cracking elevator politics, fire her without blinking man, had just turned down what most men would have reached for without a second thought, and done it with such quiet certainty that it landed in her chest like something being repaired rather than something being refused. She felt tears threaten again, and absolutely refused them. "You're not what I thought you were," she said. "You thought I was a mid-level manager with a personality disorder. You heard that? Sung Min has very thin walls in his office." Something broke open in Rachel's chest, not grief this time, something warmer and more dangerous. She laughed, actually laughed, and it was the realest sound she'd made all day, unpolished and genuine. And Jaewon watched it happen with an expression that he did not bother to hide, like a man watching something rare and deciding he would not look away. "Come," he said. "Your birthday isn't over." He took her to the top floor of a building she didn't know he owned, a private space above the city, open to the night sky, with a table that had been set at some point during their coffee shop hour by someone who received a phone instruction and asked no questions. Food. Candles. Seoul spread below them like a second sky. Rachel stood at the glass edge and looked down and felt the specific vertigo of a life shifting beneath her feet, not falling, shifting, the way tectonic things move when pressure finally finds its release. Jaewon came to stand beside her, close enough that the warmth of him was a presence against her arm. "Your father's company," she said. "How does it feel? Being back. Taking it." A pause. "Like putting on a coat that was always yours, but you refused to wear." He looked out at the city. He built all of this. Every floor of that building. Every acquisition. He did it without ever once asking me if I wanted it. He just always knew I would come back for it eventually. His jaw tightened briefly. I never got to tell him he was right. Rachel turned to look at his profile. The grief there was old and compressed, the kind that had been lived with long enough to become part of the architecture of a person. "He knew," she said. "Men who build things for their children always know." Jaewon looked at her. In the candlelight, his eyes were less guarded than she had ever seen them, and the space between them was very small and charged with everything neither of them had finished saying in the car. "There's something else," he said. "About my father." She waited. His will. He turned to face her fully. He had one condition attached to the formal transfer of the company: marriage. Within the same week, I took operational control. He watched her face carefully. He specified, not status, not background, not money. Someone humble, someone sharp, someone kind. A beat. He wrote specifically that skin color was irrelevant to him, that he'd seen too many men build empires and die alone because they were too foolish to recognize the right person when she was standing in front of them. Rachel's heart was doing something she was no longer trying to manage. Jae-won, I'm not telling you because of the will, he said immediately, firmly. I'm telling you because you deserve to know all the cards on the table. You told me once that half-built evidence protects the guilty. I'm not keeping anything from you. She looked at him for a long moment. The CEO who had cracked a marble table with his palms. The man who had stood between her and Daniel's hand, without flinching. The person who had said everything when she asked what he wanted and made it sound less like possession and more like intention. Ask me something real, she said quietly. He stepped closer. One step. The distance between them now was the distance of a decision. Have dinner with me tomorrow, he said. Not a birthday, not a work meeting, just dinner. Yes, she said. The word landed between them simply, cleanly, and Jae-won exhaled like a man who had been holding something carefully for a long time and had finally been told he could set it down. What followed was not a fairy tale. Fairy tales are passive, things that happen to people. What Rachel and Jae-won built was not passive. It was dinner, the next night, and an argument about acquisition strategy 3 days after that got so heated, Sung-min physically left his own office. It was Rachel presenting her completed findings on the secondary ledger, 5 names, fully documented, and watching Jae-won read through it in silence before looking up at her with an expression she now recognized as the highest form of respect he was capable of expressing. It was hands brushing over shared documents and the specific agony of wanting to close a distance that professional context kept recreating. It was the night she was working late again, and he appeared in her doorway in his jacket and said simply, "Come home." And she understood without discussion that he meant his home, and she went. And nothing that happened that night was rushed or sad or born out of someone else's failure. It was everything he had promised to wait for, arrived on its own terms. And it was extraordinary. Within the week, exactly within the week, because Kang Jae-won was many things, and imprecise was not one of them. He sat across from her at breakfast in his kitchen, in the apartment she had begun leaving things, in the way you leave things in places you intend to return to, and slid a document across the table. "My father's will," he said. "The marriage clause." Rachel looked at the document, looked at him. "I want to be clear," he said, "that this is not why I'm asking. This is context. What I'm asking is separate from the document." "Then ask," she said. He reached across the table and turned her hand over, not taking it, just opening it, palm up, like he was reading something true in it. "Marry me, Rachel Mensah," he said, "not for a will, not for a week's deadline, because I have never once in my life met someone who treats my worst behavior like a minor inconvenience and my best behavior like a reasonable baseline expectation. And I don't want to spend whatever comes next without that." Rachel looked at this man. She thought about a lobby and a button and 4 minutes of untangling and an elevator and an auditorium and a whiteboard and a coffee shop and a stretch of quiet road where he had turned her down with more tenderness than most men managed in their best moments. "Your father," she said. "Did he actually write that skin color was irrelevant?" Page 4, 3rd paragraph. "Can I read it?" He pushed the document closer. She read page 4, 3rd paragraph. She read the words an old man had written, a man she'd never met, who had built an empire and raised a difficult son and somehow known in the specific way that people who have lived fully sometimes know things, that the right person would not arrive in the shape anyone was expecting. She set the document down. "Yes," she said. For the second time in a week, still clean, still simple. Jae-won's hand closed around hers. Outside, Seoul was already loud with mourning, all that commerce and motion and the city's relentless forward momentum. Inside the kitchen, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't empty. The kind that's full of something that took a long time, and several wrong floors, and one very stubborn button to arrive at. The wedding was small, intentional. On the last day of the week, exactly as the will specified, which Rachel found privately hilarious, and Jae-won found privately relieving. Sungmin cried, which he denied for months afterward. Dara flew in from Lagos and said, "I told you so," before she even put her bag down. And at the reception, when someone asked Rachel how they met, she said simply, "He was rude to me in an elevator. I told him he needed to be fired." Across the room, Kang Jae-won heard her and said nothing. But the look he gave her, private, warm, absolute, was the look of a man who had been found by the right person and knew it. He had hated the idea of women in his space his entire adult life. He had not known until a woman walked through his entry lane with a coffee and absolutely zero awareness of who he was, that what he had actually hated was the absence of the right one. If this story gave you everything, comment what your favorite moment was. Share this with someone who needs a Jae-won in their life. Like, subscribe, and stay close, because there are more stories just like this one coming. Thank you for watching.